Welcome back to the Poetry of Night. I'm thinking this time of modes of inner displacement that pull us into a non-diurnal state that is not only uncanny, but what I think of as almost the intimate uncanny. Here, our typical modes of framing the world are so deeply quieted that we can see things differently. And it's as though we find a changed sense of self, or that feeling in which, as Rimbaud put it, I, that is, our typical sense of self, is an other, j'ai un autre. Our I, our inner self, is something else, somebody else, not known. The most alive poetry, I think, is in constant unfolding discovery of what we might now be or be becoming. It's at some distance from what we already know. It feels foreign, perhaps strange, estranged from, displaced from our already known self. Rilke's famous poem, Entrance, is almost a set of instructions for this. In daily life, as in the process of writing, it was included in his 1902 collection, The Book of Images. Here it is in a translation by Edward Snow. Entrance. Whoever you are, in the evening step out of your room where you know everything. Yours is the last house before the far off, whoever you are. With your eyes, which in their weariness barely free themselves from the worn-out threshold, you lift very slowly one black tree and place it against the sky, slender, alone, and you have made the world, and it is huge and like a word which grows ripe in silence. And as your will seizes on its meaning, tenderly, your eyes let it go. Another way we might get to this state is via sleeping or dreaming. And this is what Anne Carson does in her book, Decreation, a title already involved with the notion of stripping back what we have built. She records this in the following passages. My earliest memory is of a dream. It was in the house where we lived when I was 3 or 4 years of age. I dreamed I was asleep in the house, in an upper room. That I awoke and came downstairs and stood in the living room. The lights were on in the living room, although it was hushed and empty. The usual dark green sofa and chairs stood along the usual pale green walls. It was the same old living room as ever. I knew it well. Nothing was out of place. And yet it was utterly, certainly different. Inside its usual appearance, the living room was as changed as if it had gone mad. As far as I can recall, I explained the dream to myself by saying that I had caught the living room sleeping. I had entered it from the sleep side. And it took me years to recognize or even to frame a question about why I found this entrance into strangeness so supremely consoling. For despite the spookiness, inexplicability, it was and remains for me a consolation to think of it lying there, sunk in its greenness, breathing its own order, answerable to no one, apparently penetrable everywhere, and yet so perfectly disguised in all the propaganda of its own waking life as to become, in a true sense, something incognito at the heart of our sleeping house. It is in these terms that I wish to praise sleep as a glimpse of something incognito. Both words are important. Incognito means unrecognized, hidden, unknown. Another writer who invites us into a companionable and intimate sense of the uncanny is the Macedonian poet Nikola Madzirov, who happily has been interviewed for Poetry.LA, and you can listen to him reading and talking about his work right here. I encourage you to do it. Macedonia has faced so many invasions and regime changes over the centuries, even in Nikola's lifetime, that his experience brings a whole new literal level to the ideas of displacement and liminality. When you think of it as a threshold state between one realm of being and another, his life experience is full of quite literal and uncomfortable shifts and displacements. And yet his poems display an unusual equipoise and invitation into the more spiritual and welcoming dimensions of liminality. When I read and reread the poems in his book, Remnants of Another Age, I keep having the feeling of the poet perched just to the side of the spaces he's describing, dead or alive, perhaps behind some velvet curtain, very near us as he invites us into the spaces he creates. In fact, whenever I give students a prompt based on his work, I call it the poem as though you are already dead, not at all to sensationalize a moment of death, but to allow them just enough sense of inner displacement to be able to see their current life with new eyes. The idea is to feel somewhat displaced from a normal sense of oneself and life, almost as though one were a character in a play on the set, looking at everything around them with that approach. Madzirov gives us a great example of all of this in the first poem in the collection, entitled After Us. One day, someone will fold our blankets and send them to the cleaners to scrub the last grain of salt from them. We'll open our letters and sort them out by date instead of how often they've been read. One day someone will rearrange the room's furniture like chessmen at the start of a new game. We'll open the old shoebox where we hoard pajama buttons, not quite dead batteries, and hunger. One day the ache will return to our backs from the weight of hotel room keys and the receptionist's suspicion as he hands over the TV remote control. Others' pity will set out after us, like the moon after some wandering child. As with Rilke and Carson, he manages enough, just enough internal displacement to allow for a completely fresh view of the places and habits in his daily life, along with a current of longing and the feeling of charged relationship that threads through many of these poems. Even the title of the book encapsulates the strangeness of looking at our own era through the eyes of some future time. It reminds me of something Robert Pinsky would sometimes advise young poets to do, which was to look at their own poems in living spaces as though they were archaeologists from some future time in order to see things anew. And it's instructive to hear how Madzirov, in spite of the degree of displacement and rupture in his own life, talks about feeling at home in those threshold spaces between one realm and another. This is the very essence of liminality.